Greetings, everybody. My name is Dr. Andrew Mclean, and I want to talk about the first principles of training. First principles and pattern recognition are the two things that make up our ability to analyze problems and to analyze methods and to analyze what goes on in training. So first principles is very important. It's what we rely on heavily to understand much about behavior, and medicine, of course, relies on first principles. A little bit about myself. There it goes. I'm a scientist. My background is in zoology and my PhD was in equine learning and cognition. And I've also been very fortunate to have had a strong sporting background with horses as well, chiefly in eventing, but also in show jumping, dressage, and I rode in bareback races in Australia and New Zealand. And more recently, I've been involved with training elephants. We train elephants through our not-for-profit charity in 5 countries in Asia. And these two things have really influenced me so much, those two various elements, the academic side and the equestrian side, because one heavily informs the other and it goes both ways. So it's been interesting for my career to be able to see the world through these two different lenses. What is equitation science? Well, equitation science is really everything that we want to know about equitation. It's really about being able to define and measure what happens in equitation. So obviously that is a very, very broad area because it not only involves learning theory and ethology, biomechanics, and many other aspects of the horse, but also the human part, the human psychology, sports medicine, all of those sorts of things fall into the very broad realm of what equitation science is about. It's very important to recognize that equitation science is not a method. Many of us who train horses, we all have our own methods, but equitation science includes all methods and it informs all methods. It's really a set of hoops and beacons that helps us to guide us to know what certain actions and training things that we might do to horses are likely to work and what are likely to not work, what's likely to be more efficient and what's likely to be less efficient. And of course, those elements are really important when it comes to horse training because we want to do it in the most humane and most efficient way possible. Equitation science, of course, is very young, 20 odd years old or less, and it does not deny the things that we are yet to understand about horses. For example, there's a lot about the human-horse bond that we don't quite understand. We can understand a little bit more of it nowadays, having begun the journey into attachment theory as it relates to the horse-human bond, but still there's a long way to go and there are many, many more unanswered questions. And I think it's important to recognize that there are more unanswered questions than there are answered questions. The first principle, and all of these, by the way, are numbered. So this is principle 1 of 10. And the first one is the regard for human and horse safety. With all of these principles, there's a caveat in the little box. And down there it says, disregarding safety greatly increases the danger of human-horse interactions. What we have to be recognizing is that horses are big animals and their flightiness as well as their size poses quite a significant risk. So we need to be very aware of that and avoid provoking aggressive or defensive behaviors. We've got to recognize that certain areas of the horse are more dangerous than others. Luckily, horses, when they do, if they strike with their front legs, unlike other animals, like elephants, for example, horses only strike straight in front of themselves. And so we need to take this into consideration where we stand and how we operate around horses. We need to recognize that the way we use our tools and equipment is really important. Also, we need to be effective, and that means that if we plan to do things to horses, we've got to make sure that we're completely clear about what we want to achieve and that we're capable of doing it. And if we're not and we become ineffective, that can cause the horse to become more aroused and confused and somewhat dangerous. We've got to also recognize that humans and horses are appropriately matched. I always say to people that compatibility is more important than love when it comes to horses. We've got to make sure that we're compatible with that horse. And in many cases, we see that people's ambitions to have a very flamboyant moving horse is well beyond their capabilities. We should also avoid using any methods or equipment that cause pain. And there are many of these. And I think as we look into the future, we'll see that there are a lot of things that will change. For example, nose bands are often far too tight, as the work of our ISES president, Ola Doherty, has shown. There are so many things in so many areas in horse training, from the use of tongue ties and all sorts of other methods that are used in various sports, such as racing. I should also mention eBark, that we have an online survey that gives you a chance to compare your horse to other horses and other horses in similar cohorts and other horses that are similar in all sorts of elements. And this also stands as a great resource for scientists. So please have a look at eBark on the internet. We should also recognize the nature of horses. And of these things, the things that really matter are these welfare needs in particular, that we've got to recognize that the horse is born to chew. It's not just something he wants to do, he needs to do it mentally. And the research shows that he needs to chew around 13 hours a day. And obviously that's not necessarily, and it's not, it's clearly inappropriate to give high value food as forage for this many hours, but just high fiber, low quality food such as hay is really important for them. Horses are social animals and they need each other, and we need to recognize that. And doing things like enabling horses in stables to be able to touch each other not only is important for them, but will show great benefits to owners and trainers, because the horse is now more mentally secure. Horses need movement, and they also have a need for a certain amount of exercise per day, like most animals do. And we'll often see, when we deprive them, that all sorts of problems that arise. Horses also, like all animals, need consistent communication, and that particularly refers to our communication with horses. And I'll talk about that a bit later, because it's really about the quality of our training. We should avoid aversive management practices like whisker trimming and ear twitching. We need to get away from these ideas that we have to be dominant in the horse-human relationship, because it can lead to wrong thinking and poor outcomes. It's much better that we just recognize our role is to train the horse and teach him using learning theory as best as we possibly can. We need to recognize the signs of pain, and there are pain ethograms out there. We need to know that the horse that's showing the behavior problem is not showing it because he's in pain. This is a vital aspect before we embark on any training journey. And we should also learn from the great horsemen that came before us about how we move around horses, that we move smoothly and quietly in non-threatening ways, and we speak in nice quiet voices and not aggressive shouting voices, because that can also increase the arousal level of horses. We need to be aware of the horse's mental and sensory abilities and not overestimate or underestimate his mental ability. recognize that they see and hear differently from us. We should avoid long training sessions. We should avoid thinking that horses are just humans with furry coats and they think just as we do, with the same kind of reasoning abilities, which they don't have. They don't have that elaborate, very human area of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex where we think and imagine and dream up all of these things that we plan to do. For the horse, he really lives very much in the moment and acts uh, in very more predictable ways. We should also avoid implying mental states when we describe and interpret horse behavior, such as saying my horse is a psycho or whatever. Um, we should, or an asshole, all those things that people say the horse is when they have problems, when really we should just turn the mirror to ourselves and look at what we actually did wrong. So we need to do these things to avoid having welfare consequences, and we need to get it right. We should have regard for the horse's current emotional states, and that's very much about affective states and recognizing that we need to train and be very consistent. The consistent outcomes are very important. Avoiding the use of pain and discomfort, avoiding uh, flight responses, and maintaining minimal levels of arousal for whatever we do with horses. Helping the horse to relax a lot with stroking rather than patting, stroking on the neck, because we know that stroking and touching the horse in this way lowers heart rate and therefore makes him more relaxed. Soothing voices, relaxed postures in our training where instead of high head carriages, but lower head carriages when we're teaching horses things. And also avoiding high arousal, not only in negative reinforcement, but also in positive reinforcement, that recognizing that high arousal can lead to problems and also can lead to problems for the horse's own mental state. We should also recognize that the horse can suffer. It's not a machine. And we should give him the that respect and make sure that we do things in fair and kind ways so that the horse can thrive in his interactions with us and thereby encourage positive emotional states in horses. So if we don't do these things, this can lead to uh, declinations of the horse's affective states and mental well-being. We need to use habituation and desensitization methods correctly and choose the right ones for horses when we see that horses have problems because they're fearful of certain things. But we should also recognize that maybe the reason the horses are fearful of things, for example, if he's neophobic and scared of new things, maybe because the training program itself is confusing. This is definitely number one training principle before we start thinking of just desensitizing the horse as if it's all his fault. But certainly there are occasions and there are certainly horse temperaments that do show higher proclivities to be afraid of certain things. So thereby we might use certain desensitization methods such as systematic desensitization, where we bring the horse gradually closer or the thing he's afraid of gradually closer. And systematic desensitization can also be used in tandem with all of the others. Overshadowing is where we can get control of the horse's limbs and step him forward and back while aversive objects are brought a little bit closer. We should do that systematically to avoid flooding. Overshadowing itself is not a flooding technique if it's done carefully and you take a long time. If it's suddenly too much, then that will be flooding. Counter conditioning is a very successful approach where we can change the value of something that the horse perceives as aversive to now something that he sees heralds a food reward. Um, we can also chase moving objects that he's scared of. We can do that in hand or under saddle. And again, we can do it really quietly by moving the big ball away. And when it moves away, then we lead the horse towards it. Then we push it away further and lead the horse towards it. These sorts of things can really help horses become unafraid of moving objects and other objects in their um, in their world. Uh, this approach conditioning is very useful for horses that are fearful of motorbikes, and I've used it also with elephants that are afraid of tractors and motorbikes as well. Um, Also using differential reinforcement and just ignoring undesirable behaviors and reinforcing and targeting the desirable ones. The idea of stimulus blending is, it's a limited one, but it's about if the horse is afraid of something like um, aerosol sprays because there are a lot of flies around, we can, if he's not afraid of hosing and he's quite okay to be hosed with the hose, we can gradually use the fly spray as we use the hose, again, doing it very gradually because the sound of the hose and the characteristics of the hosing basically blur the characteristics of the aerosol that he was formerly scared of. And then you can gradually, over time, switch the hose off and the horse will be not aroused by the aerosol anymore. But in all cases, we should avoid flooding. It's important that we use operant conditioning well and recognizing that operant conditioning works because of consequences of that behavior. And in other words, that's all about reinforcement and punishment. Of course, any form of punishment we use, we should be very cautious about that because in almost all cases, in my understanding, punishment would only be necessary if we actually did everything else so wrong. Punishment is not necessary if we actually use operant conditioning, and in particular, positive and negative reinforcement correctly. And our tactile pressures are correct low, that we should always start with a minimal pressure and remove at the very first sign of a desirable response. Any delays in reinforcement, whether it's positive or negative, are not only ineffective, but they're also unethical. And we should also use combined reinforcement as much as we can, whereby we amplify the use of negative reinforcement or pressure release with positive reinforcement. And that can be in the form of clicker training. It can be in the form of scratching the horse at the base of the withers, uh, which may also be heralded by um, a vocal sound such as good or something like that, that we reserve purely for a reinforcement strategy. The use of combined reinforcement very much makes our training much quicker, and it means that we'll be able to use less strong negative reinforcement and of less duration as well. So it's a very powerful tool to recognize that if we use negative reinforcement, which of course we do when we ride horses because we have reins in our hands and legs on their body, and it's the release or the softening of the aid that basically rewards the response. That is the proof of negative reinforcement, but we can amplify it with positive reinforcement. And so therefore, what I'm saying about the lower half of the bottom two quadrants of operant conditioning, that is positive punishment and negative punishment, we really should not need to use them. And I really don't see much point in negative punishment, which is like the naughty corner where you, for example, if the horse is pawing, maybe you might walk away because walking towards the pawing horse might cause him to continue pawing the ground because it might reinforce it. That might be what he wants, is your attention. So walking away might help. But basically, you've really got to look at why he is pawing the ground. What makes him not comfortable to be where he is? Because things like fence walking are seen as vices. But why does the horse want to leave? We need to ask ourselves those questions. He's not just doing a bad thing when he's fence walking. He's actually telling you he needs to leave. And you need to understand and ask the questions, why does he want to leave? Number 7, the correct use of classical conditioning. We need to make sure that any cue that we train the horse must be done in a certain sequence. In other words, the cue comes first. For example, if we're asking the horse to walk on with a pressure release of the lead rein, and now he does that quite well, and now we want him to learn the word walk on, we must say the word walk on just before we apply the light signal of the lead rein to the head collar, and then of course release. And that's the most optimal way for him to uptake the new cue. If we say walk on during the pressure, it can still work, but it's less efficient. So the sequence is always that the classically conditioned cues come first. And that's why we precede all desirable responses with light signals, because of the classical conditioning phenomenon. We should also recognize that avoiding unwanted stimuli is a really important thing to overshadow them. Otherwise, they take control of the horse. For example, we might be riding and something flaps in the breeze like a branch, and the horse responds, and now that has overshadowed our aids. So we've got to be very careful that other stimuli in the environment don't overshadow our aids. And the most important element of that is not only your consistency, but your training environment, that you set up an environment that's as free of distractions as possible to embed the early stages of the learned responses to a place where they now become good habits. And then they will be stronger and more robust and more able to withstand external influences. And I do know that the people that have taken the longest time to train their horses have the best outcomes and have the most mentally secure horses. We should have also avoid shortcuts. We should do our shaping as well as we possibly can and recognize the horse doesn't know what we want. He doesn't know what our goal is. So we've got to break down all of our training tasks into very small achievable steps. And we've got to progressively reinforce each step towards the behavior that we want. So that means just planning those steps and working out how you would achieve the response. And much of that is about having a consistent environment and only changing one aspect of a time if we're training. For example, the same trainer in the same place and the same signal, and then building our behaviors progressively. And the second last one is using our signals and cues correctly. There are a couple of very important areas here. We've got to make sure our signals are easy for the horse to discriminate from one another. And when you look at where we sit on the horse, they're not altogether that easy from the horse's point of view, and in terms of how many things we may want from that horse in terms of behaviors and reactions. So we do our best to make sure all our signals are a little bit different to each other to make them as easy to recognize as possible. We've got to make sure that each signal has just got one meaning, because if it has more than one meaning, that can lead to confusion. We should make sure that our signals for different responses are never applied at the same time. In other words, if we can give a rein aid or we can give a leg aid, and if we time those with the biomechanical responses, and that's the value of walking, is that in the walk, all of the limbs are equally distant and we can apply the aids in exactly the right timing. And by doing that and getting our good habits in the walk, as they say, the walk is the mother of all the gaits, we can ensure that the horse will be less likely to be confused. And then we can build on it in the faster gaits of of trot and canter. And from there, we will find that the behaviors are more set because we've actually formed these habits in the walk. And the final one is about the regard for self-carriage. We should aim for self-carriage at all levels of training, and that simply means that we've got to recognize that we're teaching the horse to self-maintain the gait, the tempo, the stride length, his direction, his head and neck carriage, and his body posture, because that is training. So we should avoid forcing postures. And that's why my picture here is with a horse at a Grand Prix level with a double bridle, that even with a double bridle, uh, and the horse appears to know its work well, we've always got to give a small softening of the reins just to check that everything stays the same and he has learned what we've asked him to learn. And that means we've got to avoid nagging him with the legs and relentless signaling from the reins. As I say to people, when you've trained a bird to sit on your arm, you need to let go of his wings. Because if you let go of his wings and he flies away, then he never was trained. He's just being forced and held there. And so this particular and last item, number 10, the regard for self-carriage, is really vital in our training. So thank you very much.